Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer, and today we're, of course, going to have another incredible episode for the audience today. So hopefully you enjoy, and you're listening to the premiere at 5 o'clock Eastern Time, Monday sharp, just like all the true Greer heads out there when you're listening to this. But whatever you're listening to it, I hope you're enjoying it and are going to get an informative experience out of it. So we've got a couple of different topics today. And the first topic I'm going to discuss, you may be seeing the title, but I'm not going to be discussing the title topic yet. We'll get to that later on in the podcast. But I first want to respond to some of the critics and feedback I received from my big column last week on national divorce, the national divorce delusion, and why it's not going to happen. And I highly recommend everyone go read that at Highly Respected Substack. If you haven't read it already, it's at highly-respected.substack.com. Just scroll down to see National Divorce Delusion and read it if you want. And if you haven't already, make sure to sign up for... There's a free subscription to Highly Respected Substack, so you can always get those incredible columns delivered straight to your inbox whenever they appear. And we're going to have more of those columns this week. But this column, generated a lot of attention because everyone was talking about national divorce last week after Marjorie Taylor Greene, for some reason, called for national divorce. And went on about it. Some of the things, I don't want to belabor the points, but there's a few follow-up points I want to make in response to some of the critics. And the first thing, there's problems with national divorce, but I want to get first to the definition of national divorce. National divorce means two different things to most people. It either means outright secession, that Red America or whatever type of breakaway state is completely separated from the rest of America. It's its own nation state. It's no longer a part of it. The other definition is just federalism, or a more increased version of federalism, which is what Marjorie Taylor Greene followed up with in one of her follow-up threads to her initial call for national divorce. Now, both sides will have this very arrogant and condescending tone. It's like, well, you just don't understand national divorce. It definitely means secession. And then the other's like, oh, well, when we say national divorce, we just mean more federalism. And it's both sides, it means both things to a whole lot of people. And it probably makes more sense to say that it's outright secession because, to say that you're still within the state, just more federalism, it means that you're still in your marriage, but you're in different bedrooms, or you're stuck in the man cave and the wife gets the bedroom. I don't know how that works out, but you're both still in the same household. You're still technically in the marriage, but you're exploring other options. Maybe it's like a polyamorous marriage of some sort. I don't really want to know what it's going on there. But if it's national divorce, it means clear split. So I think if you're looking at the name of it and basing on what it means, you would think it means secession. But all these people don't want to say that, and they just say, well, we mean more federalism. And it's like, well, why don't you just say more federalism rather than coming up with a stupid term of national divorce? And as I don't know if I correctly got this across in my column, but national divorce is clearly a very popular term because, as I've talked about in a lot of other, podcasts and columns, is that a lot of the right, dissident right, mainstream right is now determined by Gen Xers. Marjorie Taylor Greene is a Gen Xer. All the people advocating for the mainstream, people advocating for national divorce are Gen Xers. Michael Malice, David Reeboy, all these people. It is all these guys and gals who are in their 40s and 50s, experienced divorce as children. Their parents separated and they've even experienced divorce of themselves. Marjorie Taylor Greene herself is going through a divorce from her husband after she was exploring too many options while married, I guess, with fitness instructors. And now she's, doing her thing. I otherwise have Marjorie Taylor Greene does some good things, but she also does some really wacky things, such as this. So she's experienced her divorce herself, and divorce has always been a common factor of life, or a defining factor of life for Gen Xers. And that's why they come to this term. It's like, well, if my parents felt they had irreconcilable differences, or if my shitty ex-wife felt like she needed to get away from me, why can't I get away from this stupid country? And, well, countries are not marriages. You just can't just say, I don't like this thing, I'm filing the divorce paperwork, and I'm heading out. There's a lot of problems with that, and that's usually not how nations work. I mean, and how secession movements work. But I'll get into these additional problems with national divorce that I didn't fully spell out, or I need to spell out a little bit more today. And I got a ton of feedback from and people using these arguments, so it's worth going into that. But before getting into that, you really need to understand the psychology or the mental outlook of these people who are advocating for this. And these are bored Gen X suburbanites who have been affected by divorce, whether there was, children or whether it's in adulthood or it's just friends. They see this like world through the prism of divorce, and they feel that they should just divorce their nation, but their whole life will be the same. Like they'll still have the same home, they'll still have their 401k, everything will go great except all the things associated with the national government are gone away, and now they can create their own country from scratch while still retaining their whole standard of living, which I don't think is going to happen. But I think that's obvious to most people. So I'll go into the answering some of the responses that I got to the essay, to the column, and explaining how these people are very wrong. They need to take some more IQ supplements. The first thing I always hear is we need a national divorce to avoid mass bloodshed. Jesse Kelly makes this argument. Marjorie Taylor Greene makes this argument. Pretty much everyone who is a mainstream advocate of national divorce says we have to do this to avoid bloodshed. Now, one funny thing is like the Anons or the other people who are big national divorce fans, they will act like the leading representatives of it, the people who are making this mainstream, have no bearing on what national divorce means. Is that really what national divorce means is their own personal definition, their own individual definition as Anon, as somebody with a few hundred followers. That is what national divorce means. And who's going to lead national divorce is they themselves. But if this is a mainstream mass movement, those people who are making it a mainstream idea, those who are reaching millions of people with that idea are who define it and what make it make the message for why we need national divorce, far more than the 100 follower account that wants to have a very bloody civil war with nuclear weapons or what have you, or whatever reasons that they want for civil war to occur or national divorce to occur. You need to focus more on the leading representatives of that, because if it ever became a real idea, which I don't think it will be set by the people who are currently bringing it to the mainstream, which are not the 100 follower account for reasonings that they are advocating for this. So there's always that, like, people are like, who's saying this? I'm not saying this. And it's very like hyper individualist attitude that always comes along with dissonant politics, even though these people demand a collective action. They all think that, like, well, I don't think that, thus it's wrong, and no one's saying that. It's like, well, the bigger accounts who are advocating this idea are saying it. So anyway, back to the point is that they say we need to avoid we need national divorce to avoid mass bloodshed. And that's assuming that right now we have a lot of building up violence, is that there's a lot of violent conflict going on in America, a lot of political violence and terrorism going on, and also that the right is getting fed up and that they're about to do some really bad things, and that this is the assumption that conservatives are about to form their own IRA, and there's going to be mass riots from the right, and terrorism and all these terrible things unless they get their own state. That's complete bullshit. The right is not doing anything. And the level of political violence in this country is historically low compared to other time periods. You can go back to the 1920s, tons of race riots. You had a really aggressive left-wing communist movement that was leading labor strikes. You had a backlash to the labor strikes. You had left-wing terrorism where they're putting bombs in front of the attorney general's home and other dignitaries and officials' residents, and directing a lot of that violence towards them. There was a ton of violence in the 20s, and there was a ton of violence in the 1930s with labor strike, with depression. There was a lot of aggressive labor strikes. There was these farmers were banding together and like fighting banks and refusing to allow them to foreclose on farms. There was there was right and left violence there. There was a lot more, and there's just much more social turmoil at that time. I mean, there was it's the Great Depression. They even had the bonus army that was on Washington, D.C.'s ground that they were worried might be trying to overthrow the government, and then they had to use the military to force them out at bayonet point. And then if you go into the 60s, we had mass ghetto uprisings with these race riots. And then you had left-wing terrorism. You had groups, as if you listen to my IQ supplement on the Black Panthers, you had groups like that were actually posed. It's unlikely that they're going to fully overthrow the government, but they did pose a threat to the government, and and the government was very much worried about that. And you had all these incidents, and they were willing to fight cops and shoot cops and do terrorism and do a lot of terrible things. Today, you really just have people, and it's especially from the right. The left is still doing some types of terrorism and vandalism. You can look at what they did to all these pro-life centers. They vandalized them and attacked them throughout the summer. It didn't really rise to the full-on terror campaign that I thought it might when the Supreme Court overthrew Roe v. Wade, but it still got very close. And there were assassination threats made against the Supreme Court justice. One guy even was found outside of Brett Kavanaugh's home with weapons to actually carry out that agenda. But it didn't quite rise to the level of a terror campaign like along the lines of IRA or groups like that, or Hamas, what they do in Israel, and Muslim, some of what these other Islamic terror groups have done elsewhere. But it didn't really rise to that level. But the left is still capable of initiating riots. What they saw a few weeks ago in Atlanta, where they burned up some police cars and fought with police over, police trying to knock them out of this Antifa commune they have out in the woods. But even with all that terror, with all that level of violence and aggression, it's still not to the level of the 60s, 20s, and 30s. And the main point is that you have to avoid mass bloodshed because the right, it's not the left, it's the right is about to really be unchained and unleashed. And there's completely no evidence of that. The right is not doing anything. Even when they have these protests at Drag Queen Story Hours, they're usually there's more people on the pro Drag Queen Story Hour and protecting them with armed weapons than there are protesters on the other side. And people always want to say, it's like, well, there's much more going on than Drag Queen Story Hour that they want revolution. It's like, actually, when you look at the broader picture of the big tent movement, there's all these niche groups who want separation, who have their own interests, but the only shared interest among these people is a vague anti-wokeness as best embodied in these Drag Queen Story Hours. And when you look at the public's reaction towards it, anytime the right shows up to protest, they get, you could say they get clowned on because the left shows up armed. There's more of the left out there to support the Drag Queen Story Hour, and then the Drag Queen Story Hour is just a few boomers with signs. There was a Drag Queen Story Hour in Maryland this weekend where there was like a handful of boomers getting owned by the pro Drag Queen Story Hour people because there was way more of them. And so if you're wanting to say that the right is like really, that you really have to be frightened by the right isn't even capable of doing public demonstrations anymore. And so people want to go back to January 6th, but January 6th really crippled and broke the back of any type of right-wing protest movement. And because they arrested nearly 1,000 people. And people are really frightened if they get out of hand that they're going to face, felony charges like these guys in J6. And so that really destroyed right-wing demonstrations throughout the country. Because, during the Stop the Steal, you did have a serious protest movement from the right, but J6 killed it. And now when the right ever sees anyone appear in public, they think it's a fed op. Whether it's there was these protests in favor of the J6 protester or J6 arrestees, and everyone's like, this is a fed op, the FBI organized this. Or even if Patriot Front shows up in public, they all say that it's FBI agents. Or any other group, they all think that every public demonstration is a fed op. There's no militia, there's no serious militia movement being formed. Most of the militia movements, if they ever try to do something, they're all entrapped in a scheme like with that Gretchen Whitmer kidnapping plot from Michigan. There's not any real threat from the right to the regime. There's not any worry that they have to think that the right is going to do any mass bloodshed. I'm not saying that as like a terrible thing. I mean, that's like a good thing. I don't think people should be, as I've argued continually, you should not be fantasizing about these criminal or evil ideas, these ridiculous ideas about imagining yourself as a terrorist, because one, you're not a terrorist. Two, you're just going to be arrested. And three, like, the whole public is not ready to support that type of antisocial behavior, that type of criminal behavior that you would engage in. So all it would be doing is, you expressing your own misanthropy or your own alienation with the rest of society and accomplishing nothing from that. It'd be actually accomplishing the opposite, is that you'd help your own side with any type of violence committed on behalf of your political beliefs if it came from the right. So the argument that we're going towards bloodshed or civil war is just not found in reality. I mean, it just seems that way on Twitter when, there's a heightened rhetoric and people, lots of vitriol and all that. But when it really comes down into real life, if we're going to bloodshed, you would think that these protests outside of Drag Queen Story Hour, people are getting shot or getting really hurt, or there's like massive brawls breaking out, and it's happening everywhere, which it really doesn't happen. It's like a low energy protest against the Drag Queen Story Hour. Antifa showing up with AR-15s, and the boomers who came out, or the few people who came out to protest the drag queen event, look outmanned by the opposing side. So it doesn't look like we're heading towards bloodshed by these demonstrations that are happening, and the right is not capable of this. There's a good point that was being shared around that I shared. It was a friend who made this comment to me in a DM, and it's about how the differences between the right and left, in terms of who they have, is that a thing you have to realize about the right is that the right is primarily composed of people with something to lose. It's like middle class people, property owners, people with jobs, people with families. That is a huge part of the right. The left has a lot of this lumpen proletariat or lumpen bourgeoisie of guys who have literally nothing to lose. They're drug addicts. They work dead-end jobs. They're homeless, or they're living in these Antifa communes. They have a ton of people they can call on to do street activism and do this type of violence. The right doesn't, because the right, a lot of these guys are like, well, I got to go take my kid to a baseball game, or I've got these plans, I got a big project I got to do for work, and I can't make it. Or even if they do that, it's like, if I get involved in street activism, I know that I'm going to lose my job, I'm going to lose my home, I'm going to lose my social reputation, I'm going to lose everything I've built up just by attending a protest with a sign. And so most of the right says, well, we're not going to get involved in street activism. The left has tons of these people. It's like, well, even if I get arrested, like, what happens to me? Like, I don't have anything to lose. I don't have a family, don't have a real job. I'm addicted to drugs or whatever that they're up to. And so they have this whole army ready to be unleashed. And so that's why there's this discrepancy between the right and left. But as long as the right has a lot of people or is primarily composed of people with things to lose, they're not going to turn to violence. They're not going to turn to these aggressive demonstrations, because they all know that these things are going to lose. The things that they're going to lose. And so the only way to really advance their interests is through the normal political process, where these people are not risking everything they've built up to achieve ends. And so they're not going to be doing street brawls with Antifa anytime soon, or joining up in the cul-de-sac IRA or what have you. So we're not on the way to bloodshed. So that argument doesn't make sense, because we're not a politically violent country. Political violence is at a historical low. The right is not capable of violence and even the left, I don't think, is quite capable of the level of like an IRA or something, where they would have to. Yet at this point, they're not capable of that. And so you're not having massive labor strikes, or you're not having J6s every month, or these BLM riots. And you could point to 2020, but if you look to 2020 and say, well, we had these BLM riots and all these things, and there was that level of violence. But if you want to point to that was like a lopsided, violence. That was one side doing all the violence and the right not showing up to challenge it. And the one person who showed up to challenge it, Kyle Rittenhouse, nearly faced life in jail if he had not raised millions of dollars for his own legal defense. But I'll get to that 2020 stuff in another moment for reasons that, for another problem with this theory. Now, the second thing that people have always been saying is that the idea that they insist that it will be peaceful. And I don't know if people are doing this to just say, deflect from federal attention or whether they genuinely believe it. But the government is not going to allow you to peacefully separate. We've already set a precedent for this. And people always want to dispute it. It's like the Civil War happened a long time ago. Okay, the Civil War may have happened a long time ago, but now we have a much stronger military, far stronger federal apparatus. Not only do we have the military, you have all these federal law enforcement agencies. Even their National Guard depends heavily on federal funding. All these things are within the federal government. And, there is also was settled this question over whether a state can peacefully secede. The Civil War said, no, you cannot peacefully secede. We will go to war against you. We will crush you to ensure that you don't secede. And in order to peacefully succeed, you have to have leverage. Now, the states in the South had a lot of leverage because, a lot of these military officers joined them. They had, connections with Britain and France and other European countries that were dependent on them, strong economic ties with them. They had all these things going for them, and there was a weak military, very small military that couldn't keep them within. They didn't have this massive federal apparatus where these states were dependent on federal funding as they are today. And yet the federal government raised a massive military to crush them and eventually bring them into the Union. And there is no leverage for a state or any group to demand peaceful separation. Everyone just imagines that there is going to be some peaceful separation, like whatever group, no matter how niche your group is. If you're trying to restore the Habsburg monarchy on American soil, you think that just by giving a nicely worded petition to the federal government that they'll let you have like all of Montana or all the Mountain West to enact your Habsburg monarchy restorationist government in America. They're not going to do that. They're not going to let you take parts of their country because it's not simply just separating. You are taking something away from the federal government. You are taking resources away. You're potentially inviting in a hostile enemy into your country if you make a deal with China or some other country to bring it there. This is a possibility that could happen, and this is what the federal government could see this is. That this is a threat to America, and it's a threat to its continuing power, and it's not just going to let you peacefully succeed because you just gave them a nicely issued petition. And so all these people were just saying, well, what if 70% of Texas voted to secede, and would you support crushing it? It's like, once again, my opinion doesn't fucking matter. The opinion of the federal government matters, and the federal government is going to say no. Look at what's happened in Europe when all these countries with far weaker militaries and far weaker incentives to keep these states in their grasp, whether it's Scotland, trying to separate from the UK. The UK didn't use military force against them, but they may have considered it depending on how the referendum went. Spain and Catalonia is a really great example. When Catalonia voted to secede, and the Spanish government sent in military and federal law enforcement to crack down on their protests and ensure that they did not secede. And this is supported by the EU. They would just send in the military to ensure that this didn't happen. And due to the fact that the right, all these guys want to peacefully secede, don't have any military formations outside of the government to resist this. If they send in troops, the secession effort would end. So Texas, and even if 70% of Texas seceded, I'm not convinced that would not be a keyed secession. That would be probably a cringe secession. That would because you'd have to think about Republicans usually win statewide elections by 55%. We'll say about 55%. There's a little more than half of Texas that you can expect to vote for Republicans. Now, them getting another 15%, that has to mean that a substantial number of liberals want to secede. And so this is going to be a Texas that is virtually the same as it is now, with bringing in mass immigration, allowing all these they'd have to allow LGBT stuff in that state, because a lot of those liberals aren't going to vote for a total gay ban, because that's what liberals really care about. You're not going to get 15 to 20% of liberals voting for secession if they're going to institute a whatever type of depending on your denomination, Christian theocracy, even though I'm sure the denominations would all fight over which form of Christianity would be, they're not going to vote for that. And they're not going to vote for, sealing off the state from immigration. It would probably be just a Texas that's the same, but it's not getting federal funding, which I don't know if most of the state would, once the state realized how dependent they are on federal funding and being a part of the national economy, which, the federal government would have ways. Even if they did succeed, they'd have an embargo on it and ensure that it came back to the union. And I don't think a lot of people would, second guess why they did this. But this is all theoretical. I don't think Texas is going to secede, even if people are pointing out how over 60% of Texans want to secede, and it's like, if that actually was coming up as a serious question, 60% of Texans would not vote to secede. Scotland, where it's a serious effort, it's roughly about 45% of Scots who want to secede. And Scotland actually has a serious, plan and agenda. If they secede, they'll rejoin the EU. And, they're a set government where they have much more hostility to the UK. They're very dependent on government funding from the UK, but they feel that the EU can maybe replace that. They really do have a set plan to getting away from the UK, much more so, and it's supported by national leaders in Scotland. But even there, only 46% want to. And if Texans were actually made aware of what would happen if they were to secede, it would not be 70%. It would probably be 70% opposed. So that's one thing. And anyway, the main point is the state is not going to let you peacefully separate unless the state collapses, which national divorce is then the least of your problems, because it's fending for survival at that point. But the state is not going to let you peacefully separate. They already made that clear in the Civil War. And even when states want to implement radical states' rights, like they did during the Civil Rights era, where all these southern states were, far more forcefully opposed to the federal government than any state right now, people want to say, oh, well, we're seeing so much resistance from DeSantis because he just says Biden sucks, or let's go Brandon. Compared to the state, in the South during the Civil Rights era, all these southern states were closing down public schools. They were all defying a federal court order, defying the federal government, and inviting federal troops to come in. And when, and there was even a low-level terror campaign going on in the South, there was armed uprisings over integration, such as at the University of Mississippi in 1962, where one black student attended, and they literally had a mass armed uprising where guys were shooting at federal marshals with shotguns and rifles. They had a way, and they had to send in these federal troops down there. And another thing is, even in that situation where the vast majority of the South had a unifying cause and had a defined reason for defying the federal government, even there, the federal government was able to exert its power by nationalizing or federalizing the National Guard and making them listen to the national government. So all these guys in the National Guard would have agreed with, the armed insurgents and were radically opposed to integration. The federal government told them to do what to do, and they followed it. And today, there'd be no question of where the National Guard would follow. They would not follow some governor, and there's not this unifying cause for them to rally around to, initiate this type of armed rebellion that almost happened during the Civil Rights era. And even at that time where there was this serious resistance to the federal government, nobody talked about secession from those movements. Because they realized that there had already been a set precedent, and these people were dealing with the real world and not dealing with the fantasy realm, which the right too often inhabits. Now that brings to the final point of one thing is that saying the causes for national divorce. There is no unifying cause for national divorce. People have their own various reasons for it, and imagine that that's the reason why people want national divorce. You have guys who really care about race, who are care about white identitarians or what have you, and who are saying national divorce is caused by these demographic issues that we're getting replaced. That may be true for you and why you want secession, but that's not true of the mainstream national divorce people. And if it became clear that the reason for national divorce is to establish a white ethno state or a mostly white state and for racial reasons, pretty much all the mainstream national divorce people would disavow it and say that's not what we're for. We're for creating a conservative America. And another thing is you have to remember is that due to the fact that black worship rules our country, Afrolatry, red America and blue America, if they did secede, would be fighting to have more blacks. And it would be like a national divorce because they would be the dependents and the children. And both sides would be in a vicious battle over who gets more time with the children, which would be blacks, which the dependents. And you may say that's not true. No, red America would try to compete. It's like we're gonna build a country that's actually gonna uplift them from poverty, uplift them out of the ghetto. They fail under blue state America, so they would both fight to have more blacks. Maybe that even might initiate it from being a peaceful separation to a violent separation. I mean, red America would be the same as red America today, but probably more ridiculous, more stupid. And what it would do. I mean, it would just build like a giant statue of Martin Luther King, but inscribed at the bottom is like, I was a Republican. Like that would be the type of stuff. It would not be that different. And most of the radicals who support national divorce would then be demanding a national divorce from the red America, but red America may put you in jail for wanting another separation, if they totally get rid of the Constitution or what have you. So all these fringe internet ideologies imagine that the separated state will be just like what they envision. So for white identitarians, it'll be an ethno state. For integralists, it'll be a Catholic theocracy. For Orthodox people, it'll be an Orthodox theocracy. For ANCAPs, it'll be ANCAPistan, and no rules imaginable. So all these fringe groups imagine that the separated state will be just like they envision, which it's not, because the majority of people who are wanting national divorce aren't wanting, a Catholic theocracy or an ethno state. They simply just want wokeness restrained. They want Mr. Potato Head back and him not questioning his gender. They want Aunt Jemima back. This is like the very things they want. And they think that this is the best way of separation. But if you actually told them what would happen in separation, they'd be poorer, more miserable, and that state would be more open to invasion and just a ton of other problems, they'd probably change their mind. But the majority of people just want, a conservative America where wokeness is less apparent. They don't want, but that's not, it's hard to find that unifying cause because one, it's like, what is wokeness? And that goes to that question. What are the initiatory reasons for, I don't know if initiatory is a word, but we're going to say it here. What is going to initiate the uprising or the separation? They really don't have that cause. I mean, if you look at the Civil War, slavery and just the Southern economic and social order were seen as a major division in America for at least 40 years before the Civil War. And there were several times that they threatened disunion over that. And this was the political leaders. These weren't just people on the internet saying, I've had enough with the latest drag queen story hour I've seen on Twitter. I demand a divorce. These are their leaders and figureheads, the people that they respect and follow, who are threatening disunion. And there was a clear division there. It's like the slave holding parts of the country versus the non-slaving holding parts of the country. The only division you can imagine is red versus blue America, but there's tons of Republicans in New York City. There's tons of Republicans in Los Angeles. There's tons of conservatives in these places that are pretty blue areas. There is not unless you're getting into a very rural area or a ghetto where you're just going to see overwhelming 90% of this country. But we're not like separating based on ghetto versus like deep red rural area. You'd have to depend on these cities. And another thing is like, secession was supported by the cities of the South. Charleston and New Orleans were supportive of secession. Here, all the cities in the South are blue, are part of blue America. There's not a red city. I mean, the closest may be Jacksonville. There's not even Nashville, which is more moderate than other cities, is Democrat controlled. So you'd be losing your cities to the other side. And at the same time, these rural areas in upstate New York would be going to blue America. And so it's not a clear division at all, unlike what happened in the South. Of course, the South did have pockets of resistance, in Appalachia and, some of these really poor areas in like the hill country. And, it was all primarily just Appalachia, to be honest, if from going down from, of course, West Virginia separated, Western North Carolina, Eastern Tennessee, northern upcountry South Carolina. A lot of these places that touched on, or close to the Appalachia was where most of the resistance was from. But that was like a distinct minority, and where the real leaders and most very poor areas of the South, but the areas driving wealth and capital, the leading areas of the South were all for it. It's the complete opposite in today, where all the leading areas and capitals would be firmly opposed to national divorce, and it would just be these isolated rural areas that want it, and that's that. And it's not a real clear division. I mean, it's just opposing political parties. That's the best you can come up with. I mean, it's not that people want to separate into racial ethno-states. That's not there at the point. People don't want to separate into religious states of every denomination moves there, or whatever reason, or even regional. That's not it. I mean, if it was regional, Georgia is a battleground state. You can almost argue it's a blue state now. In some ways, it's a blue state. It voted for it has 2 Democratic senators. So Marjorie Taylor Greene's state would go into blue America. So the only clear one you'd have is blue versus red, and there's not a underlying cause for it. It's like people come up with their own reasons, and the only thing they can do is a vague opposition to wokeness and a demand that they stop editing Roald Dahl's books is not a reason to separate. And also the culture, the red America is not capable of producing its own culture at this point. So, and a lot of these people want to separate over the culture that's around in America. But at the same time, these people would have to import that culture from blue America into their own country. It's like there's not a culture industry, a conservative cultural industry ready to emerge in terms of if red America separated. You'd still have, I guess you'd have Yellowstone, but Yellowstone is thinly veiled liberal propaganda. So it's already available too. So, and a lot of this is over culture matters, but you're still going to be importing the culture of blue America into red America. But and that goes along with the unifying cause. And when people want to point out, they're like, well, you point to this, the type of stupidity or these kind of petty concerns with wokeness as the reason for national divorce, but actually there's legitimate reasons, and they'll point to the COVID lockdowns and the BLM riots and a lot of the events of 2020, and the COVID and the vaccine mandate and all that. But a thing to remember is that most of that stuff is now thankfully gone or reduced. Like, we're not living under lockdowns right now. Most of the vaccine mandates have been backtracked, people have retreated from or relented on that. There's still examples of that. But most people have gotten over the 2020 stuff, and we're not faced with BLM riots right now. We have plenty of police shootings all the time, or police killings, and we're not seeing those mass riots happen anymore. I think in part those are driven by anger over the lockdowns, and then it got transferred into this racial justice movement. All those things, as bad as they are no longer apparent. They're not locking us down at this moment. And you may say, well, they could have the power to do that, but it's not happening right now. It needs to be happening at that moment for people to secede. There was an example of this where, there was a secession attempt over something that was happening, and then it ended, and then the people wanting to secede looked like idiots, and they were totally discredited. And that happened during the War of 1812, is that Federalists tried to have a Hartford Convention near the end of the war, and they were going to talk about how they're going to ideas for possibly seceding from the Union over their opposition to the War of 1812. Well, the war ended, and then they all looked like disloyal traitors for suggesting this Hartford Convention, and the Federalists weren't already doing well during the war, and it pretty much ended the Federalists outright by their idea that they were considering secession over the War of 1812. Once the war ended, there was no reason to secede. And so today, people arguing over the COVID lockdowns, that's like saying it's 1816, 1817, and you're like, we're going to have a convention to secede over the War of 1812, something that has ended. And that's not how people are going to go. Like the majority of people already think, well, it's over. Why do you want to secede? Now, certain partisans would see that as still a legitimate reason. Like, well, they could do the War of 1812 again. They could do the lockdowns again. That's not how it's going to go. And it's similar with the far left during Vietnam, where when the Vietnam War was going on, the far left was having a lot of attention and a lot of support. But once the Vietnam War was drawn down and ended, all that support dissipated, and these guys were left at the fringe of American politics and ostracized because everyone's like, well, I'm no longer worried about the draft. I'm no longer worried about this stuff. I'm going to go back to my normal life. And that's the same with like COVID lockdowns, is that people have a memory of it and they don't like it, but they're going about their ordinary lives. And if it's not happening right now, they feel that there's no reason to care about that. And that's how mass psychology works. So that's the one thing you got to keep in mind, that was a 40-minute discussion, over 40-minute discussion, but there's just a lot of things to cover through that. It's a topic that really animates me, and it really animates the right. So we will continue talking about that. I'm going to go on to a topic that is related to, or I'm going to bring up a point that it's related to it, but you probably won't think it's related at first. And so that's it for talking specifically about national divorce. But I'm going to get into another topic, and I'm going to bring up a point that's related to it about the question of Balkanization. And that is with Dilbert creator Scott Adams getting canceled. Scott Adams had a rant last week on his coffee with Adams or something. Like, he was always like, grab a coffee. And all the time in these videos, like, Adams goes on like crazy rants, whether he's like condemning his own audience or just saying, like, he always says like crazy stuff on on that show. So it's like, when I saw clips of him saying that you need to get the hell away from blacks, I think it was actually get the fuck away from blacks. I was like, okay, this is, interesting that he's saying this, but I didn't think it was going to lead to much. But like Dilbert, his cartoon, his comic, is now getting dropped by nearly every newspaper in America, and it's become a huge controversy over what he said, even though he says not quite racial stuff like this, but he says, equally controversial stuff all the time on his show with his comments. So I was a little bit surprised by the backlash, but I really shouldn't, based on how America is right now. It was just the fact that, like, Scott Adams says similar stuff all the time, and he's not really faced a backlash from it. So what did Scott Adams get in trouble for? Scott Adams looked at a Rasmussen poll that showed only a little over half of blacks said it's okay to be white, or agree with the statement that it's okay to be white. So Scott Adams said that, like, oh, well, only, nearly half of blacks think it's not okay to be white. They're a hate group. You need to get the fuck away from them. They're hateful. And then he argued that he has no desire to help out blacks anymore. It's like, white citizens should not be invested into helping out blacks. It's a useless enterprise. He talked about how bad black neighborhoods are because of their crime, and that how nice white neighborhoods are. And then he went into how he was tired of seeing all these clips every day of blacks beating up whites, and how he was frustrated with it. So he got a little too red-pilled. Actually, he's a little too truth-pilled. But everyone decided to cancel him and said he's supporting segregation in this. And then he did an interview with one of these Hotep guys. I forget which the Hotep guy. It's one of those guys who always goes on, like Rogan or maybe Tim Pool, who had him on. And Hotep Jesus, maybe it was that one. There's a couple different Hoteps. But he went on with him, and then he sort of implied that black crime or black neighborhoods are so bad due to systemic racism of some sort. He sort of backtracked, but then at other times he didn't seem like he was backtracking. So there's a little bit of confusion over it. But the Scott Adams message was received out there. And even Elon Musk appeared to agree with some of what Scott Adams says in tweets that he made. And he even said that the media is now racist towards whites and Asians. And, that was a pretty big deal that Elon Musk is saying that. And Elon Musk also noticed that latest clip of 6'7" or 6'6", 270-pound black kid beating the shit out of his white teacher who took away his Nintendo Switch. Elon Musk responded to a tweet highlighting it and said how disturbing it was. And it was also an account that talks about race realism that he was responding to. I was putting in a race realist context. So it was pretty interesting stuff that this is getting out there, and like the truth is being stated by big figures like Scott Adams and Elon Musk. And that's like very good. And what Scott Adams said, maybe in his weird Scott Adams way, what he got at was true. I don't know if maybe it was stated in the best way possible to say it, but what he said was true. And, he's being punished for saying the truth. And that's the America we live in. There's not as much to discuss about the Dilbert thing besides what Scott Adams already said. I think what he said speaks for itself. I don't know if we really need to expand upon what he says. I mean, it's all stated obvious facts that we talk about all the time on Highly Respected, and others talk about all the time about the racial nature of America and how there is so much hate for whites, and you can see the hate expressed by blacks towards whites and Asians on a regular basis, whether it's them attacking Asians or whites in these clips. And yeah, it's not surprising that so few blacks agree with the statement it's okay to be white. And also blacks are probably not even aware of that if it's association with right-wing extremists or white-wing extremists of saying it's okay to be white. And the fact that it's not like 75% or more of people saying it's okay to be white is that a strong percentage of America says it's not okay to be white is a concerning fact, and it's the way we are in America. And they just try to say, oh, well, they don't like it's associated with right-wing extremism, as most people aren't aware of its association with right-wing extremism. They just see the statement saying it's okay to be white and like, hell no, it's not okay to be white. I mean, there was a clip the people were sharing around. I don't know who it was, but it was like man on the street interviews, and they're just saying like, what are good things about white people? I think it was from Britain, and they're like, absolutely nothing. Nothing's good about white people. And then like, all these people refuse to say it, and even whites were just saying there's absolutely nothing good about whites. The man on a street interview, and if you did that on a man on a street interview, it's like, is it okay to be white? They'd be like, maybe? Or like, no, it's not. Or like, can you name some good things about whites? And most people would probably say nothing. So anti-white racism is a major factor in our society, and it's, as I always like to speak of, it's a major facet of our system's ideology, even though a lot of these mainstream intellectual dark web types and anti-woke types want to deny that anti-white racism plays any role in the system's ideology. It clearly is, by the fact of how many people would reject such a simple statement as it's okay to be white. But a topic I want to bring up that's similar to the national divorce thing is the idea of Balkanization from this story, which, one thing is a lot of people saying is that America is Balkanizing and both sides are radicalizing. And there is some truth to that. But the idea of Balkanization is that people are operating in different spheres of influence from each other's, that the left is pulling out, their sphere of influence where they're able to say these extreme things, and the right has its own sphere where it's able to say extreme things and get away with it. But in our areas of the country where this stuff is reigned supreme, and another part of the country it's like completely different, another type of extreme reigns supreme. And it's not quite how it's happening, as you can see in the Scott Adams case. In the Scott Adams case, he is getting rejected by every major newspaper for saying a simple statement of truth. And there's not a real replacement for him to go to share his views with. And he is saying something that others would have maybe not dared say 10 years ago. You have to remember, as John Derbyshire had a famous The Talk article from, oh man, it is 11 years ago now, following the Trayvon Martin thing. And all these people, Trayvon Martin happened 11 years ago. Time flies by. We'll get into that discussion in another segment. But not Trayvon Martin, but time, actually the nature of time. But when John Derbyshire wrote this article, it was for Taki Mag of all places, and it became like a national news story because, there wasn't as much news back then. And he wrote this story about the talk about how, because all these blacks were talking about, we need to have a talk with our kids about avoiding the police. And then Derbyshire is like, well, white parents need to have a talk with their kids about avoiding blacks, which essentially is what Scott Adams is saying. And he lost his job at National Review and was pilloried for this. And conservatives said, we will not tolerate this. Now you see conservatives, Scott Adams is a much bigger deal than Derbyshire. Dilbert's a huge cultural creation, and Adams himself has a large fan base. And you see a lot of conservatives, say maybe he went too far, but we are going to defend him in a way that they all rush to condemn and denounce Derbyshire for him writing the same thing. And Derbyshire wrote his in a less weird way, or put his argument in a much less strange way and in-your-face way that Scott Adams did. But under Balkanization, you would see, a number of newspapers like defend and eagerly celebrate Dilbert and how we want him to be there. But in fact, a lot of this Balkanization is happening in a very different direction that people think, because it's not taking off parts of the country and then that becomes a right-wing sphere, or the other becomes a left-wing sphere, and each has control, even when it comes down to the nature of county governments and city governments, is that everything that is institutional and even moral power, all institutional and moral power, is a monopoly of the left at the moment. And even though there's more people who are saying things like Scott Adams, or even going into a more ridiculous direction that a lot of the right wing is going into with these conspiracy theory stuff, like saying the Ukraine war is fake, Damar Hamlin was replaced by a clone, and the weather machine in Turkey, people get into that stuff. There's still people getting into the truth. But at the same time, none of that really affects the world around them. It's really just something that people log into online, and they express these views, and they find people who are willing to express them. With the left's Balkanization is that it's using its immense institutional and moral power to impose its point of view on the rest of the population, because most of the population is not evenly divided between blue and red America. The majority of the country is part of the center. Some may be leaning more Republican or Democrat, they're likely, but it's mainly a center that is not that heavily invested in politics, and especially right now is not that heavily invested in politics. You can see this is like ratings for political programming are down, while programming for the NFL is at record highs. That's indicating that people are less interested in politics now than they were under Trump. And much of this center is just wanting to get along with their life. They want to have a job, they want to have a nice wife, they want to have kids, they want to have a house, standard stuff. They're interested in their hobbies. They may have political views that lean Republican, lean Democrat, but they're mainly focused on their own interests. And that's why they wouldn't be a fan of national divorce. It's like, imagine just somebody who casually observes politics and then I have to move now and give up my house and everything I've built up to be a part of red America, which is not that much different than what it was before because of a gender neutral Mr. Potato Head. I don't know about that. They're not into that. And so, but that center is there. And a lot of them may have conservative beliefs or values, but it's not their main investment in that they're focused on. It's either job or their other hobbies or other pastimes. But all these people, when they have the view that is expressed around them, they're going to feel that a more left-wing view is imposed on them. Think about this, is that if you're at a workplace and maybe there's an employee who sends a woke screed through a company email, It's unlikely that person will be punished. It's unlikely that that person will face any consequences. It may even be fact that the company management may praise that person for their bravery in expressing some view. Now, if you send a company-wide email expressing Scott Adams' view or expressing an email about the weather machine, you'd probably get fired. You would definitely, if you express Scott Adams' thing, you'd probably be fired. I mean, if you express the weather machine stuff, people would think you're crazy and probably fire you. And also just the bad decor of violating norms of using a company-wide email. But companies are able to do this, and companies also express left-wing point of views in their own advertising and what their own initiatives do. You know, these companies will highlight is like, oh, this week we're doing so much for LGBT people, or this week we're doing so much for Black History Month and our work to spread racial equity. None of these companies are, promoting propaganda to find out the truth about the weather machine or find out the truth about the vaccines. Or I don't want to equate the weather machine with the vaccines, because the vaccines actually have a real problem. But I'm just saying that this is like stuff that the right wing cares about. So I'm not equating them. Vaccine issue is actually serious. The weather machine is not. But they're just not expressing these views. And even it comes in the case of like county governments, or just how the functions of government work. Because Jesse Kelly, even though he blocked me, I did see a tweet about how he was talking about this juror who are the four lady, I guess you would say, four women of the juror investigating Trump in Georgia. And this woman is obviously anti-Trump, just a weird Wiccan and just left-wing person, and she's doing a media tour. There's like so many violations that should not only have prevented her from being on the jury, but especially being the forewoman of this jury. And she clearly wanted to use this jury as a way to get back at Trump. And she's going there, and people are like, well, this is how Balkanization is happening. This is why you need to move more towards a red territory. She's in Georgia. That's supposedly a red state. And even if you went to a rural area in Georgia, there was the county where Ahmaud Arbery happened. That was a red county. Those guys were found guilty of murder for defending their neighborhood, for being a neighborhood watch. And, they face all these charges. I mean, it didn't matter what the county said. And it can even be said with these red counties having to resist drag queen story hour. You can find several red counties, deep red rural counties, where they're having drag queen stuff in their public libraries. And, there's not a case of a blue library hosting Francis Parker Yockey readings or whatever have you. I don't know. That's not what really the right would be about. But, having a trad Catholic mass or something of that sort, something that the right would say is their answer to drag queen story hour in their libraries. They're not having readings of that sort there. And so it's the balkanization is more of where one side is taking over more of the public sphere, and the right is being ghettoized into, where they're able to express more of these views that they wouldn't have expressed 10 years ago. Some of them are going truthful. Some of them it's a good positive step, such as what Scott Adams is saying, what people are saying about Martin Luther King. A lot of it, though, is getting just into more ridiculous territory about random conspiracy theories, national divorce fantasies, and stuff like that, where it's now that they're in the online sphere, cut off from the public sphere, and they're able to express all these fantasies and stuff, and the only feedback they have is from others. And so they think that there's a type of balkanization happening, but it's more that a lot of American culture is more homogenous than it was. I was talking about this with a friend. We were debating about this, is like whether the 90s America culture was more homogenous than today. And even though I was saying it may have been more homogenous then, I actually came up with a point that, well, a lot of people in rural America only had very basic TV, where they only got like 4 channels. That's it. They didn't even get MTV and stuff. And a lot of these rural areas, the type of music, the way they dress, they wouldn't have been aware of like the latest rap and rock music in a lot of these places. But today, thanks to the internet, these kids now dress, talk, and act the same way as kids in cities and suburban areas. And they all listen to the same music, have a lot of the same lingo. They're sharing the same TikTok videos. TikTok is a very homogenizationist process, and America has a much more homogenous culture and less divided culture than people want to admit, or at least for the right. And so it's not quite as balkanized as you would think. I think if your basis of American society is completely dependent on social media and online, you would think that people are at each other's throats in all these different spheres. And that's not saying that there's no space for right-wing people. I think a lot of these normies who are out there in the center, they don't like what they see, but they tolerate it because, as I said, their main focus is just, well, it's like, I now have to do these like woke diversity statements at my office, but what can you do? At least the game's on. And that's what a lot of people accept this. But even the way they see the world and the culture that they're indulging is just the same as it is for the left. I mean, even these right-wing commentators who are always predicting civil war and stuff, they're watching the same prestige TV shows that libtards are watching. So there's not quite that difference and dividing line between people as you would imagine. I think more of a right-wing message is getting out to people because, Tucker Carlson's still the number one cable news host, and he spreads a message that's quite different from what others are saying. And his segments on race and immigration stuff are highly rated. People really tune into that, but it's not translating into the type of formal balkanization that people imagine that's happening. Is that the control and power of the left is felt in pretty much every corner of America. That's not saying that you can't be reversed. I'm just saying that, you don't have these separate spheres of the country. Some places it'll be felt more than others. If you're in rural Alabama, you're not going to experience wokeness as much as, say, if you're living in New York City. And that's or San Francisco. You're going to experience it much more in those blue cities than you are in rural Alabama, rural Arkansas. But you'll still see elements of it there. And so people, and there's not really these like areas where the right controls in our country in the way the left does. The left controls, all the institutional powers and most of the institutions and universities, schools, media, federal bureaucracy, etc. And it's not only that, they also have a moral power. And by moral power, you may say that what they're doing is evil and wrong. But for a lot of people, when they want to think of what's moral and right, they rely on things that is determined by the left. And a lot of these crazy movements that we see now, like Black Lives Matter, the gender theory stuff, that all appeals to fundamental ideals about egalitarianism and individualism in this country. Everyone wants to believe all men are created equal and that every individual can do what they want and live and let live. And or most Americans view a lot of these things as live and let live. And so when you have these radical ideas and they're presented in this appeal to American sense of egalitarianism and sense of equality, it's hard to counter that. And that's how they have so much moral power, that their extremism is couched in this moral framework that's that can be broadly appealing to a center, or at least the center can tolerate, while the right struggles with that. And the center maybe feel like, I don't see what's wrong with this, but they're due to the institutional power of the left, they are made to like, well, we can't accept this. Such as somebody, you may have a job where a guy gets doxxed and he's been saying naughty right-wing things on the internet, and the guy may be like, I don't really care about this, but then they're like, oh, well, this is hurting my business line, is that I'm having a racist, so I'm gonna have to fire him. That person, some employee could be exposed as a trans communist or something, and then they're like, well, I'm worried about firing this person because then I'll be seen as a bigot for doing so and not tolerant. And that's how they affect their change and affect their will. I'm not, as I said, this is not irreversible. I'm just saying that this is the point now, and I don't see that there's quite the balkanization is happening. And a lot of people view this balkanization as a godsend, as a way to change the country. But if it's leading to the fact where we can't express our ideas in public And if you're at a university or if you're a college student or a professor, you can't even indicate you're a Republican. Or if your workplace, you can't indicate that you may have voted for Trump without losing your job. That creates a silencing effect where we're not able to create the change we want. And so there could be an argument that maybe a less balkanized America could have more positive effects. I don't think we're going to get that at any point, but the real point to make is that you do need to create a degree of institutional power that gives you the level of freedom to express these views and to not be punished for simply stating the truth like Scott Adams. And you need the moral framework and the moral understanding to understand that what Scott Adams says is not racist, it's not evil, it is completely true and right, is what all right-thinking people should follow. And we have to counteract this moral power that the left has and challenge it on its fundamental principles in order to achieve the change we want. So I'm planning on doing a column on this and fleshing these ideas out some more, maybe going into different directions this week. So be on the lookout for that. But that's it for that segment. Now, a final segment I want to do isn't really political, but it is some social commentary, cultural commentary I want to do. And there's been a lot of ruckus about this new teen filter that's been shared on TikTok. I think it's maybe on Snapchat too, but a lot of these older people are doing this teen filter, and they're having either the Verb Pipes freshman playing over it or Forever Young, and they're playing this, and they're having these old people see, it's like usually middle-aged people, not quite old people, and they're seeing themselves young, and they're having a very emotional reaction to it. And this going from TikTok, this is like a big deal, but then on Twitter, everyone is having uproar about it, whether they're attacking these people for getting emotionally invested in it, or whether they're saying that this is like AI stealing your soul and crushing you or some sort that's going on. So there's a lot of takes on this. And a lot of people are getting upset that anyone would be have an emotional reaction to themselves, seeing themselves young again. But I think there's like some interesting things. I'll try to keep this brief. Is that it is a real revelation about how we're a youth-obsessed culture. Is that our whole society, if you look at movies, music, everything is circled around youth. And for youth of today in the modern Western world, life is amazing for youth, as it's unlike other times in youth life. Like, I mean, we do have a set-aside period where you're like a teenager and young, and you don't have any real responsibilities, and you're able to, do all these things that when you're old and have responsibilities, you're not able to do. And you also just have a lot more of a energy to your life, and you just have all these dreams that you're going to have. And then when you're old, you've already made decisions to set your life in order, and you don't quite have the dreaming power anymore of when you're young. And that's outside of it. I mean, there's a lot of more advantages to being mature and older than there is to being young, but it's not really stressed in our society because everyone, there's very much this idea that as soon as you turn a certain age, you're pretty much dead. Like, it's over. Like, all the fun and glory days are over, and it's just like a life that you have of. Some people just think of drudgery and that. But it's a lot of it's just due to the youth-obsessed culture we have. And even what the type of music people listen to, and even movies, and just how we interact. It's usually just for kids. And even when people are listening to music or modern expressions of culture, they're like, man, I'm too old to listen to this. I want to listen to what I was growing up as kids. And we had such a great time growing up as kids. And now I have this job and this shitty wife and that sucks. I want to be 18 again. And so there's a lot of that. And that's what people are seeing this when they see their youthful visages coming out. And it's also harder for women because a lot of women, their youthful beauty is a huge part of their self-esteem and identity. And once they age, that's gone, and they become very upset looking at older pictures of themselves. So it's it's not too surprising that that's having the effect. Our culture says that we want to be forever young, and when we're not, it's It's a sobering fact for some people, even though I'm not really that old. Even then I'm thinking about like, man, I was like a teenager a long time ago. And so that creates a much distance between people. And just so how awesome like youth life is in the modern West compared to past times. The fact that most people are growing older, when for most of human history, nearly all of human history outside the last like 100, 200 years or so, making it to age 50 was a huge accomplishment. So people were, it's like, wow, you're old. That's awesome. Like, I hope I make it to 50. While today, making it to 50 is the norm. If you don't, that's the exception, if you're not making it to 50. So there was a lot more accomplishment to that. And so maybe people had a lot more respect for old age, and aging is that people show that like this guy knows something if he's made it through life for so long. And now today it's very easy. Well, as long as you're, keeping decent care of yourself and noticing any possible cancers you might have, you're probably it's the norm to make it to 50. But those who do make it to 50 are then haunted by their youth about what's gone and how they're seeing it around them, and they don't age gracefully into their accept their maturity. And maybe and I do think it has something to do with maybe the cultural output of this country is entirely centered for a youth demographic. And people feel outside of that, and they also have these attitudes of how when they were young and now they imagine that they are the old people. And it's very easy to be reminded about the passage of time in today's society where, you're surrounded by old photos of yourself. You're able to look up old movies and old news events in a way that people in the past weren't able to. So you're definitely able to be reminded of passing of time. It's just like weird ways. Like for some reason, I had it in my head. I was just thinking about the new movie Cocaine Bear, and I was like, "Oh, it reminds me of like Snakes on a Plane," because it's like like an odd title. It's like it's like, wow, it's supposed to be like, wow, that's so random to have that title. I was like, man, when did that come out? And I looked it up, and it came out 17 years ago. And I was like, whoa, that is a long time. So once you get a little bit older, you are reminded of these events and like how much of a passage of time. And then when people generally they don't see themselves, they still have this image of themselves as being, not that different from when they were 20. And then when they see, actually what they look like at 20 compared to now, it's a frustrating experience. But so some people, we maybe need to respect old people so much more, or not be so youth obsessed, so people are able to age a little bit gracefully and not have so much cope. But there's also even cope from particularly older women who are like, I'm just as good looking as I was when I was 21, or I'm even better looking now when I'm in my 40s. And it's obviously not true, but we have to elevate this cope to deal with their own neuroses. So that's like something to think about and look into. And this is just an aside I was thinking about. I thought it was like an interesting discussion that's going on. I think if people are a little bit too much up in arms, I mean, it's not surprising that people are having this reaction. And I think a lot of people, even though no matter what they're saying on Twitter, even if they looked at like they did this filter, depending on their age and how much they've changed, I think even they would be like, whoa, or have some type of reaction towards it. But Twitter is like a different social media platform from all the others, and it's much more niche. It's not reflective of the American mainstream as much. I think TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram are much more reflective of social and cultural attitudes than Twitter is. And it's worth reminding ourselves of that. I think if people did that on Twitter, obviously there'd be like everyone making fun of them and saying it's cringe. Right or wrong, I think there's good and bad there, but on the other platforms, people are like, this is so powerful and so emotional. And that's how normal Americans think. And for a final segment, I did want to talk about the election, but we're already over time. And I've got a bunch of cognitive leak questions that I have to get to. And the 2024 election isn't going away anytime soon, so I can talk about the primary and how it's shaping up. I do want to say one quick thing is that thing I need to emphasize is I'm much more optimistic about Trump's campaign than I was when I think back in December, I did a segment on whether Trump is actually running for president. And now I see his visit to East Palestine. It's apparently Palestine, not Palestine. That's how all the news reports are saying it. So East Palestine was really vintage Trump. He was just connecting with these people, was electrifying these people. The way he was working, and it was a huge win for Trump. And it's just something that no other candidate could do. And a lot of his rhetoric is returning to old 2016 norm. I think he's got his mojo back. I think he can still recreate the magic. So I'm a lot more optimistic about Trump now than I was a few months ago, especially with the East Palestine visit. I mean, that was like a huge win for Trump. And it's just the way he was interacting with those people, the way he bought Big Macs for them at McDonald's, and just his mastery of retail politics is just no one can compare to it. So I think he's back on track. I'm much more optimistic about him. It's really the real questions surrounding Trump is whether he will be indicted or not, as I always go on to. But probably next week, depending on the news events of this week, we'll have a segment on the primary because there's been new candidates getting in with the two Indians of Nikki Haley and Vivek Ramaswamy. I guess it's Ramaswamy how you pronounce his last name. I'll double check on how to pronounce it later on. I really shouldn't learn how to pronounce it though. You should get a name that we can pronounce. But there's a lot of other things to go into, so we'll discuss that. Another episode, hopefully next week, depending on next week's events. So we're now going to jump into the Conflict questions. As a reminder, you too can get the power to ask me questions or suggest guests and topics if you sign up for the Conflict option at Highly Respected Substack, and that's at highlyrespected.substack.com. And make sure to sign up for the IQ supplements while you're there, because they're so brilliant. They really boost your IQ. But if you're hesitant to not sign up for it, make sure to sign up for the free subscription where you can get all the highly respected columns delivered straight to your inbox. You don't have to check my Twitter. I'm getting shadow banned a little bit, so maybe people always complain I never see your tweets. But if you sign up for Highly Respected Substack, you can get all my columns right to your inbox. So make sure to do that. So we have two people today asking. Well, we actually have three questions. So one came from Jay. Jay is always a devoted question asker. He just wanted to make sure I got to talking about Scott Adams, and of course I talked about Scott Adams, so we didn't have to worry about that today, as I had a lengthy segment on that. So it's good that he made sure that I talked about it. And so I have two people with two-part questions coming to me today. The first question comes from Hank. He wanted this to be an IQ supplement, but I don't have enough to be an IQ supplement yet. So yeah, I don't want to get into this too much, but he has a two-part question about space travel. And he said, first question, do you think we should spend a large amount of money on space travel? Yes, because it's a great adventure. It's a great achievement that we can do. Space travel is cool. I am not one of those people who is one of those saying that space is gay or space is fake or space is satanic, as some people argue. I think it's the next frontier, and yes, we should spend more on space travel, but it's hard to do when everyone is demanding gibs and wanting to demand their own, reparations and fair share of American wealth. So that's the one question I would say yes is pretty easy to explain. Now, maybe you should give it a longer answer, but that's it. I think it's just like, we need great things to achieve, and it is the final frontier. We should be, I always liked all these movies as a kid showing all these space travel and what we can do. And it is the final frontier. We're driven to explore the final frontier, and to not do that is retreating from our duty and from our people's spirit, I would say. Two, he said, the U.S. will likely land on Mars sometime around 2030. If America First Republicans are in power when a flag is planted and establish a Mars colony with a constitution, what are the key changes to make to the American Constitution? Oh, man. I don't think we're going to be establishing a Mars colony within 20 years. I don't know. With a constitution, I don't think you would need to make many changes to it, because unlike other colonization, It is true settler colony, and there's nobody we're replacing. Well, that we know of, maybe the aliens will come out and kill us and attack us. But if the aliens were there, I think we would, we would pursue a policy of not recognizing them as American citizens. Hopefully, with that, I don't know if we'd have to make any, major changes to make major changes to what we have right now, in my opinion. But a Mars colony of actually getting that up and running, that's very distant in the future. I mean, maybe it might not even occur in our lifetime, or we may be very old when it happens. And from the constitutional changes, I don't really see that there has to be any done at this moment. I mean, there would probably be needed clear examples of what rules are governing the colony. I mean, we do have a colonial experience in like the territories, so we'd probably go back to a lot of the 19th century standards. And there's not any type of people we're replacing when we're going to Mars, so I don't know what major changes would be there. But that's that's an interesting idea of what would need to happen, and maybe we should talk a little bit more about space and why it's needed on future episodes. But those are my quick answers at the moment. So that is the questions from Hank, and now we've got questions from Cargo Shorts Respector. We haven't heard from him in a while, but we're finally getting back from Cargo Shorts Respector, and he's got a two-parter too. And he said, first question, conservatives are reporting John Fetterman is brain dead, his wife has fled to Canada, and Democrats are trying to cover this up to avoid a special election. How likely is this, and if true, could they actually cover this up? I think it is true. There may be a little bit exaggeration, but Fetterman cannot do his job. There was a New York Times article about him, and he said that when he hears voices, it's sometimes like the voices the parents make in the Peanuts show with Charlie Brown show, where it's like wow 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 wow. They're not making any noises you can understand. So it's like him listening to a sentence, and it's like wow 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 wow, and it's like I can't understand a word you're saying. And he clearly has extreme health problems, which his wife, who's now the senator, Giselle, is just saying he has clinical depression, which was a brilliant move because now no one's going to talk about his health problems. Like, oh, he just is depressed. And he's so brave to admit this and go seek treatment publicly. And that's really brave of him. So he's doing this. And yeah, I think Democrats are definitely trying to avoid a special election. Maybe they would have a good chance, but they'd really just want someone they'll appoint to it. I mean, he's not going to serve out his full term. They're going to appoint someone there probably maybe by the end of the year, but they're really just waiting out the clock till they don't have to have a special election and they bring in someone new and they can cover it up. I mean, they clearly are covering up a lot. They covered up his health problems during the campaign, and he clearly still has these health problems there, and he's having to go to the hospital for stroke problems, and they're making up he has clinical depression to hide his other physical health problems. So yeah, but I think it's just going to be waiting out the clock until the Democrat governor can appoint another Democrat to it. And then they can wait till a special election. I guess it would happen in 2024 when after the appointment. There's different rules for all this stuff, but that's probably when it would go through. But that's the answer to that. I do think that there's some truth to that he is I don't know if brain dead is the correct term, but I think he is not able to do his job as a senator, but they really don't care, and they're just going to let him wait out the clock until he can resign. I don't know. His wife may not allow that. So unless they may appoint his wife, that's the real horrific thing. It's like Giselle Fetterman. I don't know if anybody really wants that, but just a really horrible person his wife is. But that's for another discussion. And his second question is, in El Salvador, they recently opened a mega prison to house 40,000 violent gang members after the president declared war on MS-13 and other gangs. Would something like this even be possible in the U.S. on a federal or state level? No. No, because the constitutional examples are too strong. I mean, they basically I mean, they threw out their constitution to do this. I'm not saying this is wrong. I'm just saying that that's what they were able to do. You would never be able to do that. And I think even in our example, you may be worried about them doing that here. Because if they could easily, say, imprison all these violent gang members, you could imagine like a liberal being like, we're going to imprison all white supremacists because they're such a danger to this country. And so they would round up every person who's like reading Vidar in New York and put them in a prison camp to ensure that they don't harm anyone. Which I could see Democrats doing if there was an example set by that. And, I mean, El Salvador has such a bad gang problem, and they have really established gangs. A lot of our gangs, due to the nature of how American, criminalization has worked, where a lot of these hardcore gang members basically serve all their time in jail, and they're not able to operate outside of jail. For a lot of times, a lot of these gangs are just youth, like 13, 14-year-olds starting up a gang, and then they kill each other or kill another rival gang. They're not really quite able to set up the type of strong gang like MS-13 is, like an international gang. It's just like a gang that's, operating in a neighborhood along the teenagers, which they're more prone to commit ridiculous and stupid acts of violence than maybe a more well-established gang that realizes it's trying to keep its members out of jail, but at the same time, you don't have quite the nature of the gangs that they have in El Salvador. So maybe it wouldn't be the right situation, the problem. I mean, really, for America, all we have to do is just get to the tough on crime laws where, these guys who have a long history of violent felonies are staying in jail for life. And for people who, if they have mental health problems, or we just keep letting them out, they're not bailed out, they're sent to jail. I mean, it's like very simple things we need to do. I don't think we need to build a giant prison to house all violent gang members. I think we just need to return to a lot of the policies we had prior to Barack Obama and then just implement those. I mean, those clearly brought down crime, and we're probably going to need to, there's going to be more of a push to bring back those policies as crime continues to rise over this decade. But going to the level of El Salvador, we probably couldn't do it. And there's probably a positive aspect to that just because of how Democrats would abuse it to, if they're like, they're putting away all these minorities. And then they would try to find a way of how they can imprison a bunch of white people who think the wrong things according to Democrats. So those are my thoughts on those questions. And that's it for the commonly questions. And that's it for our episode today. We're going to have an incredible IQ supplement later this week. It should be a guest episode, so be on the lookout for that. So until next time, stay respected.